Hi, Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about soybean leaf cupping, a phenomenon this year. It's nothing new, but unfortunately we're seeing quite a bit of it this year for a lot of different reasons that we're going to talk a little bit about. So the first thing is what causes soybean leaf cupping. I am holding a plant that has some cupping on it, but it's growing out of it, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So there's a lot of things that can cause it. Herbicides tend to be the number one thing to point a finger at. So we're going to go over a lot of that. The other thing that has a big role to play is also the environment and environmental conditions. Because what happens when we talk, we're going to get in and talk about growth regulator herbicides, dicamba, 2,4-D, things like that. Those alter the hormones in the plants. And the same thing can happen in the environment. So if there's stressful conditions going on, things like that can cause cupping as well sometimes, but it can also exacerbate those things too. So as we're talking about the herbicide interaction in the plant, if there's stressful environmental conditions, that's also going to affect how the plant grows through it. So just remember that as we're kind of talking about it. So really the herbicides that we kind of look to or we've seen a lot of is the number one, dicamba. So impacts on non-dicamba tolerant beans. But it can be coming from a cornfield, a soybean field, whatever the case. There's a lot of those. There's also the group 15s. We can't forget about that. The group 15s, things like dual and so forth, sprayed in season, can also cause similar cupping and bubbling on the leaf and puckering and so forth. Those tend to show up more as a heart-shaped instead of cupping. Growth regulator cupping tends to cup inward and tends to strap the leaf, so it kind of almost looks like you put a rope at the end of the leaf and cinched it up and pulled that leaf together. That's why the veins end up parallel instead of how they're supposed to be. But the dual chemicals, the group 15s, those can still cause kind of a puckering and bubbling on the leaf and more of a heart-shaped leaf. So there's been a lot of cases where dicamba in corn has also maybe moved, or for whatever reasons. You know, we had a non-ideal conditions this year for sure. A lot of cases, especially the corn sprays, post sprays were sprayed when it was probably a little too windy, and they might have drifted some or potentially moved after the fact. The other thing was we had, like I've been talking about, a cool May. So not ideal conditions for growing either corn or soybeans. And then we jumped into June that was windy and then got really hot and humid. That's great for spraying Liberty, but it's not great for spraying things like growth regulators, especially ones that can potentially move. So you got to remember those conditions that we had were a challenge all the way around, plus the thoughts and reminiscing about last year that comes into play. So a lot of things that cause that, and then don't forget how slow the beans grew in May. That comes to play and how it's growing out of it. So what to look for when you're out in the field. So I'm on the field edge next to a cornfield here. This did get hit by some dicamba drift most likely, and it's tough to tell now. This is a good example, it's growing out of it, but these were shorter beans, especially here on the end. So that's the first thing that I look for when I get into a field. Is there any patterns? Is there any patterns that are man-made or not, nature, so forth? Things that you can pick apart and look for. You know, you always want to evaluate the situation. Is there more than one bean technology in the field? Can you get an understanding of maybe there's an extend bean around a neighboring field or something that you can look at and help make that decision? But you can also look at like I said, the neighboring field or road ditches, look at the weeds and see what's going on. Get an understanding of what kind of weeds are cupping and so forth. Obviously, any broadleaf weed is going to cut from a growth regulator herbicide like 2,4-D, dicamba, and so forth. The other thing that you want to do, that I always do when I get to the field, is stage the cupping damage. So you're going to do a growth stage on the soybean, but you're kind of looking for which leaves are impacted. This is going to help us kind of determine, give the grower an idea of, how quickly it'll come out of it. We can't necessarily guarantee that, but it gives us an idea how long it's been going through this stress, and whether it's going to pull through it in the next week or two or not. So in this case, if you look at this soybean, it's tough to see all of them, but I'll just help you out. This is the second trifoliate here, and it looks like the cupping damage, the drift, started showing up in the third, possibly the second. So this was, like I said, from corn, so it was early to mid-June spray, and started growing through it. So here's the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, still showing damage. You can see the cream colored tip there, and the seventh trifoliate that still has some damage as well. We get up to the eighth trifoliate here. Obviously this was well after it's probably started flowering. It shows a little bit of bubbling, but it's growing out of it well. And the newest leaf here, the second to newest leaf, looks really good. So this helps us understand this one is growing through it, growing out of it. Now there's two different cases when it comes to this. This is the best case scenario. So if it got sprayed early and we're looking at recovery right now as it's going into reproduction, that's a good thing. If it got hit later from a bean field or so forth, it's stunted, it's cupped right now, really bad, shortened growth compared to the rest of the field. That's the other thing I look for. You know, is there a pattern as it goes across the field? Was it drift, that it's shortened up the beans? That's going to kind of indicate potential yield loss to us too. Those kind of things stick out. So in this case, you can see these inner nodes in between here also shortened up, and that's typically what happens. That's the response of the plant. It's going through a stress, it wants to get out of it, so it's going to push out as many leaves as it can to grow through that. So it's going to shorten up those inner nodes. It's going to pump out leaves as quick as it can. And, you know, typically you see every couple days, 2 to 3 days, it's going to push out a new leaf. It may still take that time just because it's stressed, but it's going to push them out as quickly as it can, back to back. It's just going to shorten those inner nodes and keep pushing out new growth until it can put out a leaf that's producing good and not struggling through the chemical. So the plant itself is going to continue to metabolize that and grow through it the best it can. But like I mentioned before, when it gets hit, really the key. So this one got hit early. One thing you want to remember with this kind of damage is it's going to show up about 7 to 10 days after it gets sprayed. So any of the growth regulators are systemic herbicide, not contact like the burners. There's a lot of burners, Cobra and so forth, burning, smoking beans right now in the last couple weeks. But the growth regulators are systemic, so the plant has to grow through it. So it's going to show up about 7 to 10 days after they sprayed. It's when you start seeing that damage, and then it's going to continue to show up on the new growth on the top part of the plant. So that's what you always want to look for. You want to see where it started and then how it's growing out of it. What do those top leaves look like? And then also, what's the height difference? So if we're coming into reproduction and you're just noticing the last 2 or 3 leaves are getting hit with some kind of cupping, it's going to have a little bit of a long road ahead of it. This is not a time that it wants to be stressed. So that's the biggest difference. If it got hit early, you're likely not going to see a huge yield loss from all the research that's been done. Believe it or not, this is not a rare occurrence. The growth regulators have been around for a long time. And if it gets hit early, like by corn, it usually doesn't show yield loss. But if it gets hit later, especially coming into reproduction, and you're seeing a decrease in height, then it's likely going to take a hit because those flowers are trying to stay on there. And if it's stressed, its only focus right now is trying to survive. So it's going to be pushing out those leaves. Flowers are going to be getting more aborted than they typically are. So you're going to be having those challenges. So number one is the timing of the injury that it got hit. Look at those patterns out in the field. Look at the size of the soybeans. Obviously, when it gets hit at a younger stage, it's better off. But the other thing I mentioned early on is we had a lot of small beans from the month of May and slow growth. So when it's small, it takes a lot more to grow through it too. So if you have small beans, late planted beans, whatever the case, they're going to struggle through it for longer. So all those things kind of add up. But take a look, see how many trifoliates have damage on them. Take a look and see height differences across the field. That gives you an indication of how it's going to grow out of it. And there's no formula, magic formula to know how long it's going to take. It really depends on how much of that product it took in or absorbed to tell you how long it's going to take to grow through it. So those things are impossible to know, but you can ask questions and kind of figure out who sprayed what in the area and get an understanding for what might be out there and really narrow it down. I didn't talk a lot about it in the beginning, But the biggest indication of a strong dose to me is when you can drive by a field and see a cream or yellow tipped soybean leaves. Obviously the soybean field doesn't look great, so you stop and look at it immediately. But those cream colored tips, and when it looks like it's had a rope pulled on the end of it and it's got parallel leaves, if it's got the cream colored tips, to me that's kind of it's got a pretty strong whiff of it. If it's just got some bubbling and crinkling and stuff, it probably didn't get hit too bad, so it may not take near as long to grow out of it. But if it's really tightly curled up, bubbled bad, cream colored tips, it's going to take a while to grow through it. So hopefully this helps out, helps give you an idea what you need to look for. Like I said, go out there, do like you normally do when you scout, and look at those soybean plants and see visually how they're responding. You don't like to see short, tiny plants, but they're going to pump out leaves until they can grow through that. So evaluate the severity of the situation and just talk with the grower and see what their next move or what they really want to do with it. So feel free to give Mark or myself a call. We're always here to help. Thanks.